It was a small, little-known regional conflict whose echoes are still being felt today. The impact of the First Jewish Roman War on history and faith in this episode of the Accessible Faith Project. Hi there, I'm John, and welcome to the Accessible Faith Project. If you're new here and looking for insights into the Bible, faith, and history in ways that engage your brain, regardless of your faith stance, then please hit subscribe and that little bell icon so you can be notified anytime I upload a new video. Even if one is familiar with the stories of the Bible, we may not be as familiar with the history that surrounds them. Everything in the Bible was written in conversation with the history of the Near East, and those various works were written against the backdrop of events that were happening around them. You see, history isn't about giving a list of dates and times, but rather looking at how events are interconnected. Even though you may never have heard of it, this conflict shaped Western history far more than most of us realize. In a few of my previous videos, I've talked about the First Jewish Roman War in passing, but what exactly was it? How did it start, and why are the echoes of it still being felt today? As a basic definition, the First Jewish Roman War, sometimes known as the Great Revolt, was a rebellion in the Roman-dominated areas of Judea and Galilee against the Roman Empire. The open conflict started in 66 CE and mostly ended with the siege of Jerusalem 4 years later. However, it wouldn't be until the infamous siege of Masada in 73 CE that the Romans finally stamped out the rebellion. On the surface, it was a Jewish revolt against Roman imperial rule, but as with most conflicts, it was far more complex and had many characteristics of an internal civil war that had roots that went back some 600 years. The majority of Israel's history has almost always been in a relationship with or under occupation from a larger external power. Whether it was the Egyptian, Assyrian, Babylonian, Persian, Greek, or Roman empires, the trade routes and territories of the southeastern Mediterranean were constantly in the shadows of an empire. Only when any of those external powers were in a state of weakness did the kingdoms of Israel experience any real independence. In more recent centuries, the conquests of Alexander the Great had an additional lasting effect of bringing Greek culture to all of those regions. This ideal, called Hellenism, was an added layer of cultural imperialism that would continue through successor kingdoms right into the Roman period. Because it brought prosperity to so many people, Hellenism became a significant part of Jewish society. However, those brief moments in history of independence lived long in the hearts of the people, whether it was in the legends and memories of a united kingdom under David and Solomon, or more recently, almost 50 years of independence of the Hasmonean dynasty. The desire to decide their fate was a major undercurrent. As much as external dominance or occupation was the norm, those moments and memories of independence and freedom for the Jewish people was a huge part of their identity. Under Roman rule, it was still there, but Jewish society had splintered over how they would get there. By the early 1st century, there had developed 4 major factions within Jewish society that all had different ways of responding to external empire, whether it was the Romans or their predecessors. Not everyone belonged to these different factions, but broadly speaking, they did represent 4 approaches: participation, separation, isolation, and violent resistance, represented in the ideals of the Sadducees, Pharisees, Essenes, and Zealots respectively. Each faction deserves a separate video, but in the lead up to the Great Revolt, these 4 each had a role to play. At this point, Christianity was still a small movement within Judaism, and was only just gaining some traction in Asia Minor. They did not have a significant part to play in the conflict, aside from avoiding getting caught in the crossfire. When the war erupted in 66 CE, it was a culmination of several smaller revolts that had happened in the region. While the causes of the war need another video, the immediate trigger for the conflict came when Roman procurator Gessus Florus ordered Roman soldiers to raid the temple's treasury. After all, he was tasked with acquiring taxes to send to Rome to fund Emperor Nero's various construction projects. This led to further unrest, and Florus's brutal response to the riots sparked an outright revolt with the Zealots or the other nationalist militias at the lead. The king, Herod Agrippa II, and his family fled the city, and the Roman garrison was quickly overwhelmed. The conflict quickly escalated into a full-blown war when Jewish rebels ambushed and destroyed the Roman legions sent from Syria to put down the revolt. The news of this stunning victory quickly spread, and many more volunteered to join the rebellion with enthusiasm, recalling the glory days of the Maccabean revolt that led to independence 200 years earlier. On the Roman side, this was a major embarrassment. When news reached the emperor, Nero and the Senate ordered Vespasian, along with his son Titus and a sizable military force, to re-establish control over Judea and Galilee. While on the surface, the Great Revolt was against Roman rule, it was a civil war. When the Romans fled or surrendered in those first days, all of the factional divisions that had been building burst out into the open. The initial armed response was directed at the Roman military and leadership, but it didn't stop there. Soon, anyone who was seen as cooperating with the Romans, including those who adopted aspects of Greek Hellenistic culture, were the enemy, whether they were Jewish or not. As the Romans mobilized and then systematically moved to retake the territories, the situation only got worse. The Romans were ruthless in putting down the rebellion, but the Zealots began killing off anyone who sought to negotiate a truce. Inevitably, the Roman legions, now under the command of Titus, had found their way to the gates of Jerusalem 4 years after the Great Revolt began. In the ensuing siege, significant parts of Jerusalem were destroyed, including the Great Temple. In the aftermath, two of the factions, the Sadducees and the Essenes, were all but wiped out and never recovered, as so much of their ethos relied upon the existence of the temple. The last of the Zealots met their end at Masada 3 years later, and it would be the Pharisee faction that had the wherewithal to survive the impact of the war, transforming into what we now know as Rabbinic Judaism. Another major shift that happened in the aftermath of the war, that Christianity was no longer a movement within Judaism, but was growing into its own identity. There's a whole story to be told there as well, but the result was that only one of the 4 factions of Judaism survived, and Christianity was increasingly understood as a religious tradition distinct from its origins. It was in direct response to this that more writings would emerge, including the Gospels. This new reality born out of the disaster that was the First Jewish Roman War would continue to shape the world throughout history right down to today. Hopefully, this video has given you a small taste of what that was. So in light of this, what questions does it raise? Would you like me to get into some more detail with the different factions and the like? Let me know in the comments section below. And so if you want to explore this in ways that will expand your horizons and deepen your understanding, regardless of your faith stance, then come and join us on this journey by clicking on subscribe and that little bell icon, and you're all set to go. And I'll see you next time on the Accessible Faith Project.